Okay, so I'm kind of desperate to talk about Dana White being on a podcast with the Nelk Boys, with Bradley Martin on it, Steiny, Kyle, and then there's this one guy who I've never seen before. I don't know if he's new to the podcast, whose name I don't know, and I'll just refer to him as the guy whose name I don't know. Could have learnt his name for this, to be honest, but he's important for this because he asked Dana White a lot of questions. Dana White was featured on the podcast, and they brought up a lot of stuff. They talk a lot of political stuff, Dana giving his political opinion. But then they talked about Powerslap, and we all know Dana is a bit, I don't know what word you call it, if it's delusional or insecure or hopeful or very ambitious about Powerslap. But, he thinks it's one of the biggest things. It'll be the biggest things ever. Maybe he sees something in it that every other 7.999 billion people on planet Earth don't see. But who knows? Maybe he's got a big future ahead for it. He went onto our podcast and proudly talks about how Powerslap is going to be bigger than the UFC, which is crazy at the moment because it's like, Dana, surely you want UFC. It sounds like he's kind of like saying UFC isn't going to do that well. You know what I mean? That could be taken as a massive insult to the UFC, which is his child basically. But Powerslap is going to be bigger than UFC and boxing and all these other sports. I'm not sure, because he makes some good points, which is valid for combat sports in general. People want to see people fight. It's intrinsic. We want to watch it. We like a bit of violence. But about Powerslap as a legitimate sport doing better than UFC, who knows? Anyway, he then equates it to boxing. When he says this about Powerslap being bigger than UFC, this guy whose name I don't actually know on the podcast, when Dana says UFC is going to be bigger other way around, Powerslap's going to be bigger than UFC, this guy says no chance, not a chance. Which is a valid reaction, you know what I mean? Like, there's nothing to really suggest it will be bigger. Then Dana equates it to boxing. He said, people said that UFC wouldn't be bigger than boxing. No chance. And sort of does a little glance at this guy. I think Dana took a bit personally. He did get a little heated. Didn't lose his cool or anything, but he wanted to make a point. So he compares it to boxing. UFC being bigger than boxing, which, no one really disagrees with it. I guess it depends where you're from. Like, in the UK, I think boxing's a much more dominant thing at the moment, but people are talking about UFC a lot more, so it's hard to say. But no one really agreed that UFC wouldn't. No one really thought UFC wouldn't take over boxing. And Dana says you wouldn't have thought that 20 years ago, which is a good point because people might not have gotten behind it 20 years ago. But I think this guy, the guy whose name I don't know, he made a good point. He said, well, I turn the TV on, look what I'm going to watch. I turn on Powerslap. Someone slaps, same thing. Every match, same thing. But boxing and UFC, different every time. Dana said, "How's that any different to boxing?" Unnamed guy goes, "Well, they stand there, they rotate, slap the other person, and they either fall down or they don't." Which is it's an oversimplification. But Dana goes, well, same in boxing, they're moving the same way around, they're doing the same combinations. It's like you kind of answered your own question there, Dana. You said doing the same combinations. Like, the whole point of a combination is it's a mix up of different things. Like, it's just you're not being faithful, if you will, to combat sports if you're saying that a one slap or one movement, it's essentially like an athletics, like a track and field event, like a discus or a javelin. You're not being genuine if you're saying that boxing is just as equally complicated as Powerslap. No, there's a lot more variation to it. There's a lot more intensity. It's literally a flip of the coin most of the time with Powerslap, which is a big thing I wanted to talk about. Like, the problem with Powerslap right now is, not a problem with it, but it's a 50-50, you flick a coin and they slap each other. Once you've seen a few, you've seen them all. That's the gist of, I think, what the guy's trying to say. Like, there's no denying it's exciting. Sure, it might be exciting watching it if it's a big name. Dana got a bit heated in this. He was trying to make a point. I honestly don't think he's really ever been challenged on it, because Dana's worth billions. So people aren't telling him no, you know what I mean? Like, they're probably thinking, as long as it's somewhat profitable, as long as we're making some kind of money and we're getting paid, I'm not going to tell him it's a bad idea, you know what I mean? He's creating a lot of jobs. He's probably creating a lot of bonuses for all these workers close to him, for them pushing Powerslap. Dana's logic for it was it's easy to follow, and they talked about the next steps of it would be getting big names onto Powerslap. So Bradley Martin, Nelk Boys, whatever. And he's like, yeah, that's the plan. Superstars. We've got these NFL players and basketball players. and that would be pretty good for track and field event people who do javelin or throwing events. Anyway, he was like, these people are coming on and getting paid $250,000 in one night. You'll like it. And it's sort of like, well, then do you want it to be like an influencer boxing sort of? It's almost going into a whole different world of, it's not really a sport as it is. It's more like a spectacle. Is that the legitimacy you want of the sport? Is from the names you bring into it, not the actual sport itself. So some of the big names he talked about and the stars of it, he said recently, Paige Van Zandt and Dumpling got really big numbers, which I can completely understand. Paige Van Zandt for women's MMA, huge name. It's quite unique seeing, I think, a UFC star going into something like Powerslap, and she did it. I think she won, I can't remember. And then they're Dumpling, that guy who got really, really famous, who's a big name I saw all over Instagram and stuff ages ago. Haven't heard about him in ages. And he's come on to Powerslap, which is like something they should have signed from day one, really, isn't it? A big name behind this slapping competitions. I was like, who's Dumpling? There's no way this guy could be a big name. Looked it up and it was like, yeah, this Russian Powerslap guy, Logan Paul's going to do a slap off of him. Huge name, I'm guessing. Yeah, and he got a first round knockout or slap out, whatever you want to call it. First round Powerslap. I think there's a cap to either the people who are entertaining and going to be good at this and the people who are willing to do it. And the amount of money you can actually pay some of these big names. Like, are you going to be able to recoup $250,000 paying 4 or 5 different stars?